Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third in our series of online conferences from the Sir John Monash Centre. My name is Rebecca Doyle, and I'm very pleased to have you all online here today. As most of you do know, here at the Sir John Monash Centre, we share the stories of soldiers who fought during the First World War, and we share those to help commemorate the soldiers. Today, we'll be sharing stories of the Battle of Montbrehain. So before I do hand over to Pete and get the conference started, just a couple of reminders that I'll share with you. So for everybody who is online, we're in a webinar format. Now, what that means is that your microphone and cameras are deactivated, so you don't have to worry about being seen. But what you do have is the option to ask questions. So on your screen, you'll find a Q&A tab. You can click on this and ask questions as the conference goes, and I encourage you to do so. When we get to the end, we will answer those questions. So Pete will have a Q&A session. So please do add questions into the Q&A tab. Pete will be sharing a series of slides. All you need to do is click on the slides if you want to have the slides in full screen view. If you want to have Pete in full screen view, just click on Pete. There'll also be, for any technical issues, you can click onto the chat button. So we do have moderators who are watching and can remedy those as quick as possible. Okay, so I will be handing over to Pete shortly. Pete, for those who have joined us before, is a local guide specialising in the battlefields of northern France, and he's presented our previous conferences here at the Sir John Monash Centre. So today we're looking at the Battle of Montbrehain. Now, this was actually the Australian Imperial Forces' last battle, or last action that they saw during the First World War. So what we know of Australian involvement during the Great War is bookended by the landings on Gallipoli and Anzac Cove and the Battle of Montbrehain. So we are going to hand over to Pete now, who is going to share with you some of the tactical details of the battle, as well as some insight into the mindset of the Australian soldiers, remembering this is a volunteer force who are low in numbers and are, some 4 years into fighting. So I'm going to hand over to Pete. Pete, welcome, and thank you for this presentation.
Thank you, Rebecca. Nice to be here in the Sir John Monash Centre again. Let me get my slides up and running. Great. Welcome, everybody. So what are we doing today? Well, we're going to be covering the Battle of Montbrehain. Now, I struggle. As anybody that's listened to me lecturing before, you'll know that French is certainly not my first language. It's not even my second or third language. So I'm going to try that again. Montbrehain. Montbrehain is what we're going to be covering, the Battle of Montbrehain. I tend to... Sorry, just trying to get the slides going. Right, I think that's got the slides up and running now. So, the Battle of Montbrehain. So on the 5th of October, no, sorry, bear with me. I'm just going to get some assistance. Dropped out. Just one of those little technical problems that we have. Thank you. That's great. Okay. So sorry about that. Here we go. Let's start again. So on the 5th of October at 6:05 on a cold, misty autumn morning, the men of the 6th Brigade, 2nd Division Australian Imperial Force advanced on a 1.1 kilometre frontage against the village of Montbrehain, in what would be the last and one of the most controversial infantry actions fought by the AIF on the Western Front. Montbrehain sat just behind the recently seized Beauvoir line, which was a largely incompleted defensive position behind the Hindenburg line. But the Germans still held much of the ground beyond it. Capturing Montbrehain would loosen the German hold and allow for a springboard for further attacks. The infantry battalions picked for this task were the 21st, 24th, and the 2nd Pioneer Battalion being used in an infantry role. It's just one of the maps showing roughly the disposition of the troops. Before we discuss the battle in more detail, what I'd really like to spend some time looking at is the background to the battle and the state and the mindset of the Australian troops involved. So let's cover the background first. The Battle of Amiens was fought between the 8th and 11th of August, and it signalled the beginning of what became known as the 100 Days, or the advance to victory by the British armies. It comprised a series of actions and battles that steadily pushed the Germans back until the signing of the armistice. General Erich Ludendorff, the German commander of the German forces, will describe the 8th of August as the Black Day of the German army. It's the start of the end, effectively, for the Germans. On the 18th of September, operations against the Hindenburg outpost line were commenced. These were a series of attacks that were planned to seize the outpost line that lay about a kilometre west of the formidable Hindenburg line prior to the assault on these main trenches. On the 29th of September, the British Fourth Army's attack on the Hindenburg line commenced as part of the last of 4 consecutive hammer blows that General Foch, the Allied Commander-in-Chief, had launched against the Germans. The British Fourth Army was reinforced by 2 American divisions, the 27th and the 30th, which were attached to Monash's Australian Corps. They were to lead the attack on the Bellicourt Tunnel, and once on their objective were to be leapfrogged by the 3rd and 5th Australian divisions. So this is the first time that we're really working closely with the Americans. The 2nd Division formed the Corps Reserve, while the 1st and 4th Australian divisions had been withdrawn to the rest areas. After several days of severe fighting, the Hindenburg line was breached in this sector, as well as the Beaurevoir line behind it. I'm not going to make too many comments about some of the slides I'm putting up, but this is a particularly interesting one. It interests me anyway, and certainly some of you will recognise the artist here, Will Longstaff, perhaps famous for his depiction of the Menin Gate at midnight. Most of you will know it. It's held in the War Memorial, sometimes known as the Ghost of the Menin Road. And so this is Will Longstaff, the same artist, producing this one, Breaking the Hindenburg Line, this painting was called. So what we're going to do now is turn to the manpower situation and the general condition and attitude of men within the AIF during this period. You have to remember that this is 4 years into the war, 1918, heading towards the end. So the AIF suffered some 1,260 casualties during the outpost line operation, and a further 2,500 from the 3rd and the 5th Division were lost in the capture of the Hindenburg line, none of whom could be easily replaced. But something else was also going on. Just prior to the attack on the outpost line, Prime Minister Billy Hughes, this is the Australian Prime Minister, had insisted that the original Anzacs, those that had enlisted in 1914, should be sent home on 2 months' furlough. The first 800 had already been selected before the attack, and it was estimated that a further 6,000 men would be eligible. And this slide just shows some of those on their way, on the train on their way home. So I always kind of I like to think about this. And so let's think about, as a 1914 man, imagine that we are all been serving since 1914, since Gallipoli. How would you have felt when you were told that you were that you were on the way home? I mean, just look at the actual illustration, the photograph of these guys. They're not kind of grinning and waving and really super happy. So mindset, I've done my bit. Perhaps a lot of them will be thinking that. Relief, certainly, that they're leaving the front and the constant threat of death and maiming. Excitement at the prospect of going home and seeing loved ones, certainly. But this may have been tinged with an element of guilt, leaving your mates, your cobbers, your pals to fight on. Would you have, in fact, felt that you were letting the side down? And I think for many men, it would be a mixed view of actually being leaving the front and leaving their mates. Another thing that was happening at the same time was the disbandment of battalions. The recognised strength of a battalion between 900 and 1,000 men, but by the September of 1918, most battalions were far below the established strength. So in line with the British system, it was decided to reduce 8 of the brigades. A brigade normally would contain 4 battalions, and so they would be going to be reduced from 4 to 3 battalions, and this would mean the disbandment of effectively 8 battalions. And the manpower from those battalions will be spread amongst the remaining 3 in each brigade. I've used this illustration. It's one of my favourites, I have to say, of all of the photographs of the Great War. It's actually not relevant in a way because it's from the August of 1918, and it's a well-recorded illustration. We have Lieutenant Downes briefing his men, but I was trying to find an excuse to use it, so we just see some men being briefed by their officers. On the 23rd of September, the order was given. 7 of the battalions refused and went on strike. And so it's a mutiny, effectively, electing their own spokesman and asking to be retained in their current battalions, so not to be broken up among the others. So from my point of view as a serviceman, how would I have reacted to this news that I was going to be broken up and sent to other battalions? I wouldn't have been happy, I have to say. The glue that holds a battalion together, the esprit de corps, the shared experiences, mateship, even the colour patch on the arm, are gone with the stroke of a pen. Would I perhaps have understood from the point of view that we've got to beat the Germans and this was the best way of doing it? Perhaps. But from a personal point of view, yeah, I would not have been happy. But we have to put this in the context of other mutinies that had taken place prior to this potential disbandment. And on the 14th of September, 3 platoons of the 59th Battalion had refused an order to go forward. And on the 21st of September, 119 soldiers of the 1st Battalion walked out of the front line claiming that they had done enough. So again, other mutinies. So if such dissatisfaction existed in the other battalions, you have to kind of consider the possibility that in some way the disbanded mutineers, the guys that don't want to be disbanded, may have seen this as a valid face-saving issue and would again save them from further frontline service. So there was an element of soldiers trying to figure out how to get out of going into the front line. However, Lieutenant General John Monash, commanding the Australian Corps, realised the parlous mood within the ranks and deferred the order until after the battle. Interestingly, one of those battalions picked for disbandment was in fact the 21st. They will eventually be amalgamated with the 24th, but again, cleverly, the men retained their colour patches, so their esprit de corps continued. So what actually was the strength of the battalions going into action at Montbrehain? I think I say that name different every time I say it, but never mind. The 21st Battalion of the 6th Brigade had 20 officers and 300 men. Now remember that we're looking at, under a normal attack at full strength, 800 men perhaps going in. So 20 officers and 300 men, and it was the same for the 24th Battalion of the 6th Brigade. The 2nd Pioneer Battalion, which had actually been attached, 20 officers and 500 men, and this is purely because they've not been committed to an infantry role, so less casualties, but still 500 men, so it's low on numbers. So I think at this point we just have a quick chat about the Pioneer Battalion and their traditional role. So this is the 2nd Pioneer Battalion. I think that this illustration is them working near Bapaume, so earlier in the war, but we can see here they are filling shell holes, bridging, and so doing all sorts of labour. So pioneer battalions were a new concept intended to provide the field companies of the Royal Engineers with skilled labour and to relieve the infantry from some of its non-combat duties. These battalions wired, dug, revetted in all weathers and all terrains. Occasionally they would abandon their working tools and fight alongside the infantry. But this would be the first time that the 2nd Pioneers would be used in an infantry role. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel F. Anand, who received a bar to his DSO, Distinguished Service Order for the action here, wrote, had a tough fight but decided victory. Our battalion did splendidly in its first organised share in our attack as part of the infantry. So that's what he thought about what is coming. Interestingly, their badge, I think, was a very apt, and it's it's the crossed pick and rifle, which I think is very suitable. Not much used by the Australians. The actual imagery was used, but obviously they have the rising sun collar dogs, so you couldn't fit those alongside. So not used too much, but the imagery was used on vehicles and things. So what other units are going to take part in the battle? The 6th Machine Gun Company, the 6th Light Trench Mortar Battery, 8 Australian Artillery Brigades of 140 guns, mainly 18-pounders, with an odd 4.5-inch howitzer, and 12 tanks. All will be engaged for the battle. The units they're facing, very intermingled, but 241st Saxon Division, that was in the village itself, the 21st Reserve Division, the 34th, and that was the Reserve Division to the north, the 34th Division to the south, and the Saxon 24th Division was in support. So let's just have a quick chat now about the controversy. So there is a controversy about this battle. I wonder how I'm doing timing wise. I'll just keep me on time. Now, Montbrehain was initially taken on the 3rd of October by the 46th British Division, but lost during the fierce German counterattacks. On the 4th of October, the 6th Brigade took over the divisional sector at Montbrehain and Belvoir, and took part in local attacks. So this is the controversy. On the 5th of October, at the previous insistence of the Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes, the Australian 2nd Division was due to be withdrawn and to join the other 4 divisions at rest and reorganisation in preparation for a potential difficult winter. But their replacements, the 27th and 30th American Divisions, which had both suffered heavy casualties during the Bellicourt battle, were not ready. Therefore, the British 4th Army commander, General Sir Henry Rawlinson, retained the Australians in the line for an additional day and ordered them to join the attacks on the 5th of October. So was it necessary for the Australians to be involved in the attacks? Did Monash push too hard and incur unnecessary casualties on this, the last day of action for the AIF? C.W. Bean, the Australian official historian, said it appeared to have been carried out simply to keep the troops occupied until they were due to be withdrawn the next day. He concluded in the Australian official history of the war, it is difficult to feel that it was wisely undertaken. I'm not actually sure I agree with him, but anyway. Most reports on Montbrehain stressed the tenaciousness of the Australians. They succeeded in taking most of their objectives. Without their effort, certainly it is far more likely that the attacks to the north and the south would have failed. Montbrehain was therefore a necessary battle in the 4th Army's operation on the 5th of October. So whatever your view, and it's well worth reading more about it, we're going to move on. What I'd like to quickly discuss now is the mindset of an Australian soldier taking part in this battle. And then we'll discuss some of the personalities involved. So those that started on the beaches of Anzac Cove, about 13% of the Australian Corps were originals at this point. Many prior to the start of the 100 days had a very fatalistic outlook. The war had no end in sight. Many friends were dead, wounded, or missing. There was only the hope of a painless instant death or the terror of a lingering or life-changing wound. They lived for the moments: food, alcohol, women, a bath and a clean bed, not necessarily in that order. A fatalistic soldier, though, was often viewed as a good soldier. He got on with the job in hand. He no longer worried. He believed his time would come no matter what he did or didn't do. So that was the soldier prior to 1918. But how does that change if there is an end in sight to the war? We get a hope for survival, thoughts of self-preservation, but still the lingering terror of death or a life-changing wound. Many of the Gallipoli men, those proudly wearing their brass A's on top of their colour patches, have been slowly rising through the ranks. Many have, I suppose, not all. They have become the senior NCOs, the junior officers, the company commanders, and they're all expected to lead from the front. And I just feel that the mental tenacity and the will of these men to continue to lead by example with that knowledge that the end is in sight is quite extraordinary. So let's move on to the battle itself. So the 21st, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bernard Duggan, and the 24th, Lieutenant Colonel William James, moved in the early morning to the start line, to the left and right of the Ramicourt-Montbrehain road. As previously stated, the attack on the village began on the 5th of October 1918 at 6:05. The battle can be summarised in 3 phases: the initial advance, the Australian retreat due to German counterattacks, and the Australian counterattack and final capture of the village. I'm remembering to move the slides on today, which is good. So this is a German Maxim MG 0815 light machine gun. I've actually got one of these at home. I deactivated, I hasten to add. Not quite as in good a nick as this one. The German defences consisted mainly of the light version of the Maxim gun, which is depicted here on this slide. Dozens of German machine guns were captured during the fighting, but the rattle of the British Lewis gun could also be heard. It's a much better weapon than the 0815. You can see, not from this battle, but it's just a really good depiction from the Imperial War Museum of a British soldier carrying a captured 0815. At 6:05, the troops of the 21st, 24th and 2nd Pioneer Battalion started their advance behind the protection of a creeping barrage. That's a barrage that moves forward with them. On the right, the artillery fire was strangely light, and some of the Australian batteries opened fire. When they did open fire, their shells fell short, hitting the 21st Battalion as it advanced, causing friendly fire casualties. Not an unusual occurrence during the Great War. Very difficult with the lack of communication to know exactly where men were. The tanks, having to move through the gas-contaminated valleys, they arrived at 6:30, so did not support the infantry in the initial phase. And the German artillery counter-barrage began as the Australians advanced, and in fact that followed them in their advance, the German counter-barrage. The 21st Battalion had no great difficulty in advancing into the village. Their right flank was protected by the Pioneers. As they advanced, they discovered a line of, this is the Pioneers, a line of German machine guns in an ambush position along the railway embankment south of the village. And 2 Vickers detachments from the 6th Machine Gun Company, under the command of Lieutenant Wilkinson, eliminated this major threat by enfilade fire. That's flanking fire coming in from the side, knocking out 14 machine guns, killing or wounded 100 and routing the rest. This action was significant as it eliminated the potential flanking fire on the advance on the right of the 21st Battalion. During their advance, the men of the 21st discovered many civilians who had been hiding in the cellars of the village, coming out to meet them. And I find that extraordinary that the civilians were still there in the village. And remember, these villages had been under the German occupation since 1914. Now, this next illustration shows one of the British knocked out tanks. In fact, it says Tank Allemand here, German, but it's on the postcard. This is a postcard, but it's not. It's actually one of the British tanks that was knocked out. And it's obviously been taken in the 1920s because we can see the village children now climbing all over it. From 6:30 onwards, the tanks arrived and destroyed many enemy machine gun posts before withdrawing, several being knocked out by direct fire. So this is obviously one of those. The 24th Battalion was less fortunate in its attack, having difficulty in eliminating the German defences and trenches based around the quarry. And that quarry's still there for those who want to go and visit the battlefield. And the cemetery north of the village. And of course, the cemetery's still there, so you can find these positions very easily if you ever get to the village itself. It was here that B Company of the 24th faced ferocious fire from the village and was struggling to make ground. That was until Lieutenant George Ingram led a charge against the German strongpoint in the quarry. He leapt amongst the Germans and killed without discretion, overcoming the garrison almost single-handedly. 40 machine guns and more than 60 men were captured. He then moved off again and attacked a machine gun post hidden in the cellar of a house, killing the gunner and capturing another 30 men. For this action in the village, he was awarded the Australians' last Victoria Cross of the Great War. So this is the church just after the fighting takes place, and you can see some of the damage that's been caused to the village itself. By 9 a.m, the battalions achieved their objectives and established a number of posts around the village, but their positions were quite precarious and the ammunition was running low. The Germans then moved their reserves forward and began an intensive bombardment from Doon Mill and Brancourt. It's something the Germans were very good at, counterattacks. They specialised in counterattacking. We always had to be aware that they were about to counterattack. The attack from the northwest, the west, which was Brancourt, and Doon Mill to the southwest, so all three directions, and gradually infiltrating the village, supported by an intense barrage. The remaining Australian troops realised that their positions could no longer be held in the present circumstances and organised a fighting withdrawal to the quarries southeast of the village. So this is where they're forced out. So this is a critical phase. Both battalions and the pioneers have been resupplied during this phase, and captured German guns of which there were many, are being freely used against their previous owners. At 10:15 a.m, Colonel Duggan of the 21st ordered a counterattack. With 2 remaining platoons and the men of the 24th, whom he gathered on the way, supported by artillery, they retook the left flank, consisting of the quarry, the cemetery, and the sunken road north and northwest of the village. In the centre, a counterattack by Lieutenant William Hardwick, with 2 platoons of the 21st and the men of the 24th, who again he picked up en route, take the German positions in the village up to the road leading to Brancourt. The pioneers restored their protective flank, aided by a company of the 18th Battalion, who had been brought in as reinforcements. And the combined action of artillery, infantry, and machine guns eliminated the last German counterattacks. By noon, Hardwick's platoon were posted along the northern edge of the village and in contact with Lieutenant Gowler of the 21st Battalion, who was south of the cemetery, and Lieutenant Roberts and Robinson, 21st and 24th Battalions, respectively, who reoccupied the sunken road northeast of the village. For 2 hours, the Australians flushed out the rest of the German troops hidden in various places. Charles Bean called it a sniping party, until the village and the surrounding area were cleared. By 2 a.m. on the 6th of October, a series of Australian posts had been set up around the village, forming a salient along the front line, and the village was now secure. So this is a picture of American soldiers in the village. Montbrehain. Try again. During the night, the first American elements of the 118th Infantry Regiment of the 30th US Division relieved the Australian troops at Montbrehain. By 3 a.m. on the 6th of October, the 6th Brigade is out of the line, so they're pulled out. At about 5 a.m, so just after that, Lieutenant William Emily Hardwick, MC and Bar, MID, we've already mentioned him, 21st Battalion, was showing his map and briefing American officers on the railway embankment west of the village when the Germans shelled the outskirts. Hardwick was killed, along with most of the soldiers present, including an American officer of the 118th US Regiment. Hardwick now lies in Tincore New Bushes Cemetery, as do many of the men who died that day. Further north, after a day of fighting, the British 25th Division captured Beaurevoir, and during the night of the 5th and 6th of October, the German forces retreated to the heights of Rouvroy. Rouvroy, let's try that again. The St. Quentin sector was definitely liberated from the German occupation. So what is the cost going to be of all of this? The battle cost 430 casualties. This is the AIF we're talking about, of whom 94 were killed. Nearly 1/3 of the men engaged in the attack became casualties. So casualties covers the wounded as well. I have to be careful with that, so just watch out for casualties. When you're reading accounts of any battle, casualties are not dead. It's those that are dead, wounded. It sometimes includes the missing as well. Australians had engaged about 1,500 Germans in or around the village, with 600 being taken prisoner from 10 different regiments. Recent research has identified that 135 Australians were killed or died of their wounds during that day. And I'd also like to remember at this point the civilians who died in the liberation of their village, and they're commemorated on the Village War Memorial. So this is a fairly recent commemoration. On the 5th of October 2018, a large commemorative ceremony took place commemorating the battle. It was in the presence of the Australian ambassador and members of the Melbourne Memorial Chapel Honour Guard. I was actually there for this unveiling, this ceremony. A commemorative plaque donated by the Blue Ribbon Foundation and the Victorian Police was unveiled, and the plaque lists precisely the 135 Australians killed or died of wounds in the battle, and also Lieutenant George Ingram, who was awarded the Victoria Cross for his heroic action during the fighting. He's commemorated as well. I thought we'd now just briefly talk about some of the personalities involved in the action. This is a very sad story here. So this is 3 officers, Fletcher, Scales and Mahoney. So we're going to be talking about Fletcher and Mahoney. Captain John, known as Harry Fletcher, 24th Battalion D Company, enlisted with his good friend Captain John Austin, known as Austin Mahoney, Military Cross. They had first met at a boarding house in Melbourne before the war. Both men served at Gallipoli and were promoted through the ranks. Both commanded companies in the 24th Battalion during the battle. Harry was hit by a shell near the quarry during the advance while directing a tank and killed instantly. He now lies in Calvert Cemetery, one of the 48 Australians buried here. He was 25 years old. And his very good friend, Captain John, known as Austin Mahoney, MC, also the 24th Battalion, but A Company, was prominent during the consolidation of the village at the end until he was hit in the head by machine gun fire. And he died of his wounds on the 9th of October and is buried in Tincore, New British Cemetery. And his military cross had been awarded for conspicuous gallantry in action at Mookay Farm in 1916. He was also 25 years old. So 2 very good friends who fought right the way from the Gallipoli Peninsula to here, both lost on the very last action of Australia, the Australian infantry on the Western Front. So enormously moving story. Number 3532, Sergeant Eric Falconer Reid, MM, Croix de Guerre, so a French award of the 2nd Pioneer Battalion. He was a bridge carpenter by trade from Montbrehain, Queensland, and enlisted in 1915. He'd already seen lots of actions. He'd worked as a stretcher bearer at Bulcourt and repeatedly risked his life in rescuing the wounded. Sadly, he will be killed this day, and he also lies in Calvert Cemetery. Private 4363, John William Blankenberg, known as Russia to his pals, MM, 24th Battalion. And his military medal had been awarded earlier in 1918. And at one stage during the attack, Blankenberg's platoon commander was pushing through a hedge, and he actually hit his helmet on the muzzle of a machine gun on the other side. Blankenberg shot the entire crew for being cowards. He was later killed that day and now lies in Calvert Cemetery. So we can see here Lieutenant George Morby, or is it Morby? Some debate. Ingram, VCMM. 24th Battalion, B Company. He came from Bendigo, South Yarra, Victoria, a carpenter and joiner by trade. Had served in the militia, attached to the Australian Garrison Artillery prior to the Great War. And on the 10th of December in 1914, he enlisted and was posted to the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force, which served in New Guinea. He was discharged from that force in 1916, and on the same day enlisted in the AIF and was posted to the 24th Battalion in France. He was awarded an MM at Bapaume in March 1917 and commissioned in June 1918. After the war, he served on the Permanent Guard of the Melbourne Shrine of Remembrance. We've already discussed how he was awarded his Victoria Cross. So this is Calvert British Cemetery, where many of the men now lie. One of my favourite little cemeteries on the battlefield, I have to say. Not that far from the civilian cemetery. So that's the final slide of the battle. Just a final note, I'd like to dedicate this lecture to number 2682 driver John William Neal, known as Jack. He was of the 2nd Pioneer Battalion. He survived but was never fully well and dies at a relatively young age of the gas-related wounds sustained during the war. So that concludes the lecture. I think we're now going to go to a period of question and answers.
Thank you, Pete. A wonderful presentation, as always, and a lovely note ending on the dedication to one of the battalion members. So thank you. And it actually brings me to a couple of comments we've had in the Q&A, and particularly some questions from Veronica. Veronica, thank you for your questions. There's been quite some interest, Pete, in knowing that the 2nd Pioneer Battalion actually had an infantry role in the battle, and knowing that for those that joined a Pioneer battalion, what Veronica's got a question of, did they bargain on the possibility that they would at some point be part of the infantry? It's really interesting when the intent of the battalions and the Pioneer battalions particularly is to provide a bit of reprieve for those sort of non-combatant roles and a bit of skilled labour force. So it's actually quite interesting that there was quite a big Pioneer battalion involved in this one.
It is, and that's a very good question. Thank you, Veronica. Did they know that they were going to actually be used as infantry? Well, in theory, yes, they did, because that was the whole role, that they would be used as frontline labourers. And if you enlisted or were posted to a Pioneer battalion, then the understanding was, as the badge as well shows, that at some stage you may be asked to operate as infantry. I think the problem was that they didn't. And I know the 4th Battalion, Pioneer Battalion of the AIF, overrun fighting at Dernancourt in 1917. Equally, that was their first operation when they were actually used as infantry, and unexpectedly being used as infantry, and they discovered that they actually weren't very good at it. So I think that's part of the issue. If you don't train enough in the infantry role, then it is suddenly unexpected to be given that role. And certainly the 2nd Pioneers during the battle did a very good job, but it was their first time. And if you think that they've been fighting or they've been serving on the Western Front from the arrival of the 2nd Division, and yet this is the first time that they're going to be used as infantry, then yes, I suspect that it was a little tough for them to find themselves being used in an infantry role.
Thank you. We've got a comment here from Stephen, who's just giving a thanks, Peter, to say a most informative and thoroughly interesting presentation. So thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
David's got a question here about, did any other Australian units see further action up until the 11th of November? So looking at that period between this Battle of Montbrehain, what did happen to the remaining Australian troops?
Yes, they did. The artillery and the engineers, a lot of the support services continued. So yes, we all automatically think that everybody's been pulled out here, and that's it, the end of Australian effort on the Western Front until the 11th of November, and it's not the case. And in fact, there is a fairly, I won't go into it here, but there is a fairly, there is a bayonet charge by the engineers. So a group of engineers actually ended up being used as infantry, and death will continue. So men will continue to die from here until the 11th of November, and sadly even beyond there. That's another lecture in its own right. So I think, that perception that this is the end is not the end. Australian soldiers will continue to fight and die, but not the infantry. It's the artillery and the engineers and other support services.
And actually, just on that, we've got a good question from Paul just about that support and wondering, did aircraft support the operation, and was there that cooperation with tanks as well during this time?
Yes, there should have been, and there will have been. I haven't mentioned aircraft because they don't appear in any of the accounts, but I'm sure they would have been there if required, because certainly we're now in the period of the all-arms attacks, where we're certainly being able to pull things together. Tanks, again, the coordination with them was good, but it's still not brilliant. And as we can see, they were late when they shouldn't have been, but that's because of the gas in the bottom of the valleys that they went through. We're also still not quite getting the speed of tanks sorted out, so there are still problems. But overall, yes, much better coordination than any other period, but it's still not perfect by any means.
Speaking of communication and coordination, Callie's raised a point. You were talking about the AIF meaning to have been relieved by the US prior to the battle, and just wondering what the extent of knowledge was about that. Were the rank and file aware, or were the commanders aware of that situation?
Yes, they were. So they were expecting, they'd had their orders to say that they would be relieved, and so you could imagine the mental as they know that they have to go into action for one final time. But by this time, we're very good at planning quickly, organising. The orders would go out for the attack. So it's not as ad hoc as you imagine. You get the feel just even from my lecture that it's a little bit ad hoc, that they're suddenly told that they have to go into action, but it's not. By now, we can organise an action very quickly. They knew that they had been working alongside of the Americans prior to this. So the Americans, as we know, for the Bellicourt Tunnel battle, and previously going all the way back to the fighting at Le Hamel in the June of 1918. So yes, the Americans were firmly embedded with the Australians and will be used to replace them, obviously, after this date as well. So yes, it's not as ad hoc, this battle, as you imagine. The men would have been aware, and they would have been coordinating with the Americans. Yeah.
And I think for this battle, it was actually just almost the day before, and I think that was part of the evolution of leadership and military strategy, and that growth that Australian leaders and other troops showed, that they could plan their battles sort of in parallel with while another battle was actually taking place. So they were able to actually coordinate that, and that planning cycle actually became a lot more efficient and a lot quicker. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah.
A nice comment here from Michael, who is actually the designer of the plaque, and a couple of kudos there. So thank you, Michael. Michael's comment about Norman Wilkinson's action with the pioneers. So thank you, Michael. Andrew's got a question here about what happened with the consolidation of infantry battalions after this time. So obviously there was a lot of talk early on about the disbanding of the troops, which led to the battalions, which led to a lot of mutiny and other issues. But how did that play out then after the Battle of Montbrehain?
Well, it was playing out very well. Of course, we'll never know exactly how it played out, because Australian infantry will not go into action again before the armistice. But battalions, I think, again, Monash being quite clever, he decided he did disband some completely, and they were spread amongst the whole of the division. But most were amalgamated, and that amalgamation appeased a lot of the soldiers who hated the loss of their colour patch, their esprit de corps, and their mates, because they were going to be split up. So it played out okay. But we'll never know how well it worked, because we're still down on numbers. Australians, even having done that, disbanding one of the battalions, their numbers are still very low. So I think there would probably going to be further reorganisations would have taken place to try and up the numbers in the battalions. And certainly there would have been cooperation with Americans again. From then on, the Australian AIF would have been serving very much embedded with the Americans. They would have been working together.
And difficult too when, we sort of mentioned at the start, a volunteer force, it continues to get harder and harder to really replenish
Correct.
those numbers and
Yeah.
maintain those same number of battalions. So
Correct.
got a question here from Adam, who's drilling into a little bit of one of the comments you made earlier on about the opinion about whether the battle should have proceeded. So obviously there was a little bit of controversy around whether it should. There was commentary around the necessity of it, but also a lot of commentary that, through the result that did come from it, the necessity of it and the essential nature. So Adam would like to know, Pete, do you think it should have happened or not?
Yes, I do. I think it should have happened. I think it would have been very difficult for it not to have happened. Somebody had to attack on that day, on the 5th. It's part of a bigger action taking place on that day. So the village had to be assaulted that day, and there was nobody else there. The American troops literally weren't there. The Australians were there in position. So I think it's a no-brainer, really. It's yes, I can understand if you've been told that you're going to be pulled out the line that day, that morning, and that's you finished for the foreseeable future. How horrific to some it must have been, but that isn't the feeling that you get from the battalions. If you read the battalion war diaries, that isn't the feeling you get from them. You get the feeling of, yep, that's our job, we're here, and we're going to do a good job, and we're going to get on with it. I would like to have put myself into the actually I wouldn't have wanted to be there at all, but if I had been, I would like to have potentially have been with the pioneers to see how they felt, knowing it was their first infantry combat role. And I think that's the thing that I find the most interesting, them being used on the last day of Australian effort. They're using a battalion. I know why, it's because of the numbers, a battalion that's not been used in the infantry role before. But I think overall, I think the feeling, and I think even amongst them, it would have been, well, at last, we've been here doing the pick and shovel work, and here we are on the last day of Australian efforts. And they wouldn't know that, of course, but and here we are going to be used in an infantry role. And I think there'd be an element of kudos in that, in saying, no, at last we're going to have our final crack at getting to grips with the Germans. So no, I don't view it as a big issue, really, from a personal perspective. I think it was important that the action took place, and there was nobody else.
Yeah, and it's interesting just the point you make, that at the time, of course, they wouldn't have known that it was going to be the final battle. And, we talk a bit about the mindset of people going in wondering, did they have knowledge of the end in sight? What was their hope for survival? But what we also know, purely for the fact that they were being given a rest, they were being given furlough to come back, and the Allies were planning for the 1919 campaign. And Brendan's got a question on that about what would have been Australia's likely role in that campaign and of the 6th Division if fighting did continue.
Yeah. Reduced, I think you'd have to say, because of the reduced numbers, and becoming more of a partner to an ever-increasing American corps and American divisions who are never going to be under strength because of the number of Americans arriving. So I suspect it would be a lesser role, and possibly could have eventually seen the reduction from 5 divisions to perhaps 4. I don't know what would have happened, but certainly it would have been a lesser role. Back to your previous comment, Rebecca, I think it's interesting. Did the soldiers know? Were they aware that this was getting towards the end of the war? And you'd have to say yes, but not when exactly, because there was a long way to go. If we were to force the Germans all the way back to Germany, which of course that's what was envisaged, we are some way from the German borders. And so, a tough, long, hard winter into 1919 was expected. But there certainly was a hope amongst the men, knowing the state of some of the Germans that they were actually capturing, who surrendered fairly readily, that perhaps we were closer to the end than we thought.
I think too, it was the deepest they'd been into German territory that whole time, like you say, since 1914, Germany had occupied that area, so that was very new territory to be pushing into as well.
Yeah. And that's the other thing, I suppose. We're now out of the old battlefields of 1914 to 1918. The battlefields that we've been toing and froing over. We're into an open landscape, an undamaged landscape, and that would it was extraordinary to most of the men to be out into that. And to me, it starts to feel like a Second World War battle. with the integration of the tanks, the aircraft, the guns, all working together, and the men out in the open and fast moving and going around villages, taking them, it starts to feel like blitzkrieg almost. What the Germans are going to use in 1940. And in fact, that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to copy what's taking place now against them, enhance it, and use it against us in 1940.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it really does make you wonder how the battles would have continued to change when you've gone from trench warfare, and there's, we see it during the course of the war anyway, that how that evolves.
Yeah,
that was on the precipice of something evolving into something entirely different. Yet again, like you say, battle out in the open and forcing a very different way to do things.
Yeah, it was. And I think that's interesting, actually, when you think about the 100 Days. The 100 Days was not well covered in my youth when I first started looking at the First World War. The 100 Days was not really covered. It was almost like, well, there's 100 days of success and the war finishes. But it's crucial what happened in that 100 days. Now, thankfully, there's an awful lot of books now about the 100 days that explain fully what was going on. But in the early days, it was almost, right, we got it right in that 100 days and we beat the Germans. I think it's a British thing. We like a good old disaster. So we don't write that many books on success. We prefer to write books about horrific disasters. So, but now, thankfully, lots of books about the 100 days.
Yeah. Got a comment from Mark here saying, thank you, fascinating talk, Pete, and just sort of bringing back to how tough it would have been for those troops who did have that little brass A on their shoulder that had served in Gallipoli and were fighting themselves still years later, really just what that mindset would have been during that time.
Yeah, it is, and actually, it leads to something that I hadn't mentioned in the lecture, so it's good that you brought it out. It wasn't enforced wearing that brass A, and I often wonder how many of the Gallipoli veterans only put that brass A on when they were behind the lines. Because if you put it on in a battle, and you just have to think of new arrivals, they see a guy who's got an A on his arm, no matter what rank he is, well, he's survived from the beaches of Gallipoli to here. He must know what he's doing. So in the battle, we better follow him. He's obviously, he knows what he's doing. Let's follow him. And I think a lot of men wouldn't have liked that, especially if you don't want rank and you're still serving as a private and you look behind you, there's half a dozen blokes following you because they imagine you know what you're doing because you've got an A on your arm and you've survived this long. So I'm not sure quite how many men wore those brass A's in combat, because I think it made them stand out. And I think a lot of men don't like standing out in a battle for whatever reason. So it wasn't enforced wearing those brass A's, but yes, I do. I always think about them, those men in this battle, particularly, who had, and the cost to the Gallipoli men had been heavy in the 100 days, because they are an awful lot of the guys, as we can see from the two captains. These are the guys who are leading, expected to show the others what to do from the front. So a tough time for them. I always make the joke that during the attack, when they said, right, men, off we go, I'd have said, oh, I just need to fasten my laces. I'll just stay here for a couple more minutes while I just do my laces up. No, I think the temptation to do that, I know I've just dropped something, I'll just stay here a little while longer, must have been unbelievable. But on they go, as we can see.
So we've got time for just a couple of more questions. And I just want to bring to the topic of the mutiny. Now, you were talking about, full platoons going through this mutiny process. And also, Brendan's made a comment here about the mutiny of New Zealand troops when they returned to New Zealand on furlough, and wondering about the government's appreciation of the risks of sending those originals back. We talk about mutiny, we talk about the volunteer force as well, and wondering whether that, had more of an impact on the mutiny. What was the punishment that was befitting for people who mutinied?
Well, the punishment, obviously, Australia does not carry the death sentence, or does not carry out the death sentence, but that doesn't mean that people weren't sentenced to death. It's just that the punishment was then commuted to a period of penal servitude, depending on the severity of what happened to them. So it was serious. And certainly they would have been shot if they'd been serving in the British, or they had the potential to be shot if they were serving in the British Army. And most of them, after the end of the war, it was forgiven, I suppose, for the majority. It was just forgotten about as the war came to an end, because they are volunteers and when they're no longer needed. So if they were being held as prisoners, they were released. The question about those at home on furlough is one that I've often wondered about. Were they really, really going to come back? No, was there really the intention to return the guys, the Gallipoli men, the 1914 men? I think an awful lot of them would have been put into training roles, recruiting roles, just anything to stop them coming back to the Western Front. And I think the mutiny in New Zealand is a prime example. If you had your furlough and then you're told you're going back to the Western Front, and you're just really beginning to think that that's it, you've done your bit. So yeah, so it's a difficult. I mean, it will be a difficult time for other reasons as well. Men not being discharged quick enough. We're going to see mutinies fighting in Britain. Canadian troops. The British Army opened fire on Canadians, killing several because they're mutinying, because they want to go home and they feel like they're being held back too long. So no, so it was a time of where the military had to keep everybody occupied in one way or another. Of course, Billy Hughes had requested that one of the other things that could have happened is they could have gone the AIF. The Australians could have been used as part of the occupying force that moved into Germany to occupy some areas of Germany, especially around the Rhine. They're not, because Billy Hughes is insistent that the men should come home, that the men should be sent home as soon as possible, that the AIF has done its bit and they're needed back at home. So I think that's interesting as well, that the government was very keen at the end of the war that the AIF should be brought back as quickly as possible. Interestingly, of course, we forget that some men enjoyed the war, and I know it's a horrible thing to say, but they found they were good at it. It was something, or perhaps some of the men who just recently arrived felt, oh, damn it, no, I've just got here. And so we get quite a lot of Australians volunteering to fight the Bolsheviks in Russia, and they actually had to leave the AIF and join the British Army. But we do get a lot of Australian volunteers. I haven't got the numbers to hand, but yeah, there were enormous numbers of Australians, or a number of Australians, who volunteered for further fighting, effectively.
Thank you. Well, that does bring us to a conclusion now. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. There's been some wonderful engagement and some wonderful comments just about what people's understanding is and what people have learned. So thank you very much. For those who have subscribed, you would have had an email with a link to this conference. Using that email address, you will get another email shortly. So the conference has been recorded and will be available on YouTube and in a matter of days. So I do encourage everybody to click on that and have a look and share that around. So thank you, Pete, very much for coming along and again sharing your wonderful insight. And thank you, everybody, for being online.
Thank you.
Thank you.